Alright, so I was a little dissatisfied with my Spanish video with how I was going about with it because it was a little incoherent, I think. At least I think it was. In any case, so these are some cards I made to kind of help out with me kind of explaining stuff. I've only made like 3 of them so far. So yeah, this specifically goes over the Indo-European languages. So we have 2 sides of this one card. These are all the modern day Indo-European languages that are either now spoken. They're either spoken today or they're extinct, and they're like the end of the line pretty much. And keep in mind, not all of these languages are just categorical or category or categories. English. I hate this language sometimes. Yeah, they're not just categories. Sometimes they're also categories and languages, as in they're a language that's a category but developed into 2 different dialects, which I guess technically makes them a category. So yeah, we have a category, we have subcategories, we have micro categories, and then we have like sub micro categories somewhere here. That would be more specific when it comes to the more individual cards. So the one we're focusing on today is the Germanics, the most commonly spoken, or the most, like one of the 2 most commonly spoken, not dialects, categories of languages, which are, I guess, one of the 3 really, because the big 3 of the world are actually big 4. The big 4 of the world are the Proto-Iranian languages, the Balto-Slavic languages, the Italic languages, and the Germanic languages. These are the big 4 languages that are spoken across the world, with the Italics and the Germanics being the biggest of the bunch, to be specific. So, to start off with, we gotta go back to about 4000 BCE, roughly, with Proto-Indo-European, which I don't know why I classify as an extinct language, but I did for some reason. That's probably not true, but I mean, I guess it's technically true since nobody speaks it anymore, but then yet again, all of this wouldn't exist without that, so give or take. But people stopped speaking this language around 2500 BCE, roughly, which is when all these other languages started to come about around the same time, due to, nomadic tribes and stuff like that. People kind of spreading around the world, the Indo-European specifically, spreading around the world, all the way to the Middle East, to Eastern Europe, to Central Europe, to even the British Isles. British English. I don't know. Anyways, so yeah. One of these subcategories of the Indo-European categorical language, or category languages, is the Germanics, which evolved into 3 different types of different categories, or micro categories of languages, that being the Western, the Eastern, and the Northern Germanics. These are the main 3. These are what all of your modern Germanic languages are based off of, is the region that they come from, the Northern, the Eastern, and the Western. I don't think I have to really explain it all too much. The Northerns are obviously the Scandinavians, the Westerns are like the Central European, the Central Western Europeans, and then the Easterns are like, the Baltics, and so forth. So yeah, the one thing to know about this is that this only, which I think I already pointed out, but this does only include your modern languages plus your extinct languages, about where the line ends. So for this, you're going to be seeing these 3 languages like twice. And you're going to be seeing some of these other languages when we get more specific about a few more times, because they're different dialects for different languages and so on and so forth. So, with that being said, let's go on to the next page. The next page, or the next card, being the Germanics. So, Germanic. Clearly it's a interesting tree, I suppose. And it's one of the biggest languages, or it's one of the biggest category of languages that is spoken in the modern world. In fact, one of them is actually the biggest, being spoken literally internationally and like all around the world. I mean, there's not one country that doesn't have a minority of people who speak English, let alone a majority. Of course, obviously, again, like I said, it's English. I just spoiled it, but yeah. English is like the modern day international language, pretty much. Like every country in the world speaks a form of English of some kind, in some way. It's just what happened. I don't need to go through the history of it. If you have a textbook or a history textbook, or if you went to school, you know why English is one of the most commonly spoken languages in the world, despite the fact that English is actually one of the hardest languages to learn, because it's a Germanic language, and Germanic languages are very much so hard to learn. Unless you're a native speaker, then I guess it's not that hard. But anyway, starting off with the Germanic languages, let's talk about the Eastern Germanics first, because they are they're the easiest to talk about. Because, I mean, they only have 3 different languages here. They have the Gothics, the Vandalics, and the Bulgarians. The Burgundians? Burgundian, I think that's how you pronounce it, I don't know. These are languages that are obviously no longer extinct, the most popular of the 3 being the Gothic language. The most popular of the known, at least, are the Gothic language. The rest of these I don't really know anything about. Obviously, everybody knows about the Gothics, and also I wrote that perfectly. That looks beautiful how I wrote that. In any case, so yeah, they're all dead languages. Nobody speaks these languages anymore. They're all killed off, and they stopped speaking them and traded them for other forms of German and even some Slavic languages and so on and so forth. Which brings me to the second most, or the second least spoken, or the least spoken branch of Germanic languages, besides the extinct ones. It's the Northern Germanics. The Northern Germanics consists of all the Old Norse languages, which are divided between the Western Norse and the Eastern Norse. They're about on foot with how many, like toe-to-toe, they go about toe-to-toe with how many languages of each one they speak. The Eastern Norse, you have the Swedish, the Danish, and a dialect of Norwegian. Also Western, you have the Icelandic, the Faroese, however you pronounce that, and then another dialect of Norwegian. There are 2 different Norwegian dialects. There's a Western and an Eastern dialect, which the names of which are down here, and I don't know how to pronounce them, and I don't care to pronounce them. I don't care about giving it the time to learn how to pronounce them, because I don't speak these languages or these dialects. So I'm just going to continue on with English, because I speak English and only English. In any case, so now let's go to the most diverse and the most commonly spoken languages pretty much in the world, that just being the Western Germanics. The Western Germanics can be divided up into about 4 different categories: the High Germans, the Low Germans, the Anglo-Frisians, and the Dutch. So let's start with the High Germans. So High German is within itself not just a language, it's also a category. So I suppose it's a categorical language, which has a direct evolutionary tree towards modern German, but also towards 2 other languages, or 2 dialects of Middle German. Because technically speaking, these are all dialects of Middle German, or Middle High German, I guess. So obviously the evolutionary tree is High German, Old High German, Middle High German, and then from Middle High German you have Yiddish, Modern German, and Luxembourgish. These are technically dialects of Middle High German, I suppose. You could technically argue that. You could also just technically argue that they're not even dialects, or just their own independent languages, which is, either one would be fair to say. I don't really care which one you would call them. Both are fair to say, in my opinion. But because, let's go on to the Low Germanics, or the Low Germanic language. Also, there's Low German, which evolved into Anglo-Saxon, or not Anglo-Saxon, Low Saxon. Low Saxon, I had to rewrite because I fucked it up. Low Saxon, I don't really know where in the world this is spoken, but apparently it's not extinct, so it's probably out in the middle of nowhere in like Germany or something like that. Then you have the Anglo-Frisian languages, which is like a mixture of English and Frisian. Frisian is a language that is only really spoken in the Netherlands, hence the Dutch. And English is also only really spoken in the Netherlands and maybe Germany. I think Frisian is possibly spoken in Germany too. And I think parts of the UK kind of speak a little bit of English, maybe. I'm not too sure about that. It's a dying language. They're dying languages. Nobody really speaks these languages anymore, except for like very few people. So in any case, with Anglo-Frisian, it's kind of people kind of just group them together because they're so similar. Because for the most part, people who speak English and Frisian can typically understand each other, just barely, like enough to like understand like what's going on in the conversation. They use enough everyday words to they share enough everyday like similar everyday words to understand what's going on. Again, they're dialects. They're technically not just languages. They're technically dialects. And dialects can understand each other even if they don't say the same shit. If you hear somebody speaking Espanol versus Spanish or Spain Spanish, proper Spanish, you can hear the similarities between the two languages. There's no Spanish here, what am I doing? But you can hear the similarities between the two languages, but they will obviously pronounce things differently, and will call different words different things. Same cases with here English and Franish, or Frisian, or whatever you want to call it. I call it Frisian, I call it Franish, and I think I'll just keep calling it Frisian. I'm going to call it Frisian. Franish, or Frisian. These two languages clearly have similarities with what they pronounce in words and stuff, so that's why they're usually grouped together, so how similar they are. From that, you have the English that developed into Old English, Middle English, and then Modern English, the international language. And Frisian, which is not only its own language, but it's also a category of dialects. So it's a categorical language, as I will call it. And you have the Northern, the Western, and the Satterland Frisian languages. The Satterland Frisian languages, I think, just means Southern Frisian, which at least I'm assuming that's what Satter here means, is Southern. I could be wrong. Somebody could correct me if I'm wrong. I don't really know where this language comes from. I just know it exists. And that's what all this is really here for, is just to really show you that, like, what exists, what is spoken today, what is not spoken today. So all these languages that don't have an EX next to it, like, you know, Eastern Germanic, these are all languages that are spoken in the modern world, at least somewhere. Maybe not these languages, but definitely these languages. So I guess somebody somewhere in the world speaks Low Saxon. I don't know where, but somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Europe, probably. Okay, so then we have the very last category of Western Germanic. That, of course, being the Dutch. So the Dutch have about 3 different forms of, well, Dutch. You have Middle Dutch, which became Modern Dutch, and Modern Dutch is spoken only in, like, the Netherlands and South Africa, which has its own dialect of Dutch called Afrikaans, which is, you know, a direct evolutionary dialect of, well, like I said, Dutch. So, yeah, it's only spoken like South Africa, really, or former Dutch colonies in Africa. But in any case, that's about all I have for this video to really talk about. It's not as extensive of a language as, like, say, the Italics are, but they definitely have a huge impact despite how small the evolutionary branch is compared to something like Italic. Because if you notice on here, I have all the modern languages that are spoken that are Italic languages, supposedly. But it goes beyond what I have just here. There's so fucking many of them. And that's why I'm creating individual cards for these languages and not just putting them all onto here and then acting like that this is everything you need to know. This is only everything you need to know in the modern sense. This is everything you need to know from the beginning all the way to the very fucking end. So yeah, there you have it. Germanic languages by me.